Oh, it's a 2D. It's a 2D. It's a sequel to Fusion. Oh my god, she has the Fusion suit. Guys, oh my god. Oh my god, guys. We're doing it. Oh, we're really doing it.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
It's a sequel to Fusion. It's been too long. It's been 20 years. You have no idea.
Oh, wow. We're eating good tonight.
Oh my god. Hello. I'm going to talk about a Metroid game that is nearly 20 years old, mere days before the release of the new one, so hopefully this doesn't go horribly wrong. As of right now, at the time of writing and recording, Metroid Dread has not been released. So if you're watching this in the future, which you very likely are, hope everything's going okay for you. If there is any canonical story content in this video that has been retconned by the release of Metroid Dread, whatever, I guess. My intent with this is to be able to look back at Metroid Fusion, aka Metroid 4, in the context of itself, just one more time before it finally gets a follow-up after 19 years of people waiting. Metroid Dread was like this mystique game that like nobody really knew about, but everybody knew it was being made. It was supposed to be for the DS. It was like, there's a lot of backstory with that I won't be getting into, because today we're talking about the Game Boy Advance game that I personally really love. The intent of this is to look at Metroid Fusion in the context of itself one more time before its ability to stand as a definitive end to something is just radically changed by the release of a new game. Now, could Dread retroactively make Fusion better? Could it make it worse? I have no idea. None. Zero until I play it. I just like Metroid Fusion for what it is, and it always kind of felt like a weird black sheep of the series. No small part of my admiration of the game has to do with the fact that it was the first Metroid that I ever finished. I had Prime at launch. I was very excited to play it, like in the early days of the GameCube, but I was just a bit too young and I barely even got past the prologue, at least until I met some of my closest friends for life in like 2004. Halo 2 was about to come out, Metroid Prime 2 was about to come out. I got some taste in some like horror films. At that point, I was playing Metroid Fusion, and the reason I got it was because I saw ads for Metroid Zero Mission, and I was in awe, and it looked so good, and I went to Toys R Us to get it, and it was Fusion instead. I didn't realize that that was a game that existed. And it was a weird first challenging game. I had played hard games before, like on Super Nintendo era, dumb hard, like Lion King and Super Star Wars. Metroid Fusion was the first time I played a game that was hard, and it asked me to get better. It eased me along into that. It felt really approachable for me. I was like 11 or 12 years old at the time. So anyway, that's my nostalgic look back at Fusion before we really get into the nitty-gritty. For me, it's a distillation of the genius of the Game Boy Advance as a portable console. It was the first game that really asked me to get better. It was the first one to genuinely scare me, but in such a way that actually compelled me to move forward. It's a game that allowed me to make friends for a lifetime. Several lifetimes. So I'm biased towards it, and that's okay. So let's get into it. I'm gonna break through. In June of 2021, the gaming community was shocked by the appearance of a specter of rumors past. Not only did the long-awaited Metroid Dread suddenly spring to life after 15 years of speculation, but it's also the arrival of a new final chapter in the main Metroid series, and a follow-up to the Game Boy Advance classic, Metroid Fusion. Dread is the first new game to mark a chronological end to Metroid's story in 19 years, and Fusion was the last game to represent that moment. But Fusion was a game with a lot of conflicting opinions surrounding its release because of its structure, narrative, linearity, and stark change in tone, especially when compared to its sister game that had the same release date and the game that came before. At the time, the expectation for Metroid Fusion was to carry over the success of Super Metroid. That's a burden it no longer has to bear. Here's why. Before we delve into Fusion's ties to the future, let's take one last look at it in the context of the series' past. The following project is a deconstruction of how Yoshio Sakamoto, Metroid's lead series producer, used his drive to make this entry in the franchise as different as possible, not only from its competitors in the industry, but from within Nintendo and from the rest of the Metroid namesake. And Fusion achieves that more than anything else with innovations in storytelling.
Some of the new games look like updated takes on fairly well-known formats. In the racing game of F-Zero, you're in a futuristic race car. Oh, I guess I should watch where I'm driving instead of talking.
Even if it never sold as close to as well, the Metroid franchise has always stood apart from Nintendo's other successful IP. Where Mario Bros. Innovated active platforming that scrolled left to right, and Zelda was an expansive adventure spread across a map? Stunning, I know. Metroid came along and managed to pull off both at the same time. If you don't know the story, here's the TLDR. Fans, please don't, tear me apart for this. This is really just, I'm trying to make this as brief as possible. Samus Aran is Nintendo's historic first female protagonist. She's hired by the Federation on multiple occasions to destroy space pirates and Metroids. Her first adventure on Famicom and NES. She delves into the planet where she was raised by bird people, eventually blowing up the AI Mother Brain and escaping. The second adventure on Game Boy. She lands on planet SR-388 to destroy all remaining Metroids and their queen before they can evolve into indestructible monstrosities. But before she finishes her mission, she takes pity on a baby larva and then escapes the desolate rock. The third adventure, the big leagues. Super Metroid for the Super Nintendo. The baby larva is taken from a research lab by the Dragon Prince Ridley. Ah, he's Ridley! And Samus chases after him back to Zebus to destroy Mother Brain and the space pirates all over again, but not before the baby Metroid is fully grown and sacrifices itself in an iconic final confrontation. With 24 megabytes of storage, oh my god! Super Metroid was literally and figuratively the biggest game released for the Super Nintendo to date, and it would become the most iconic entry of the franchise. We tend to talk about Super Metroid with the same reverence as we do The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time or Super Mario Bros. 3. It was a lightning-in-a-bottle landmark piece of software that took the blueprint of what came before and used the technology available in 1994 to make the decrepit ruins of Planet Zebus feel alive. We still talk about its level design, its music, its non-verbal storytelling, how its art style holds up, and the open-ended nature of item collection for experienced players in the form of sequence breaking, deviating from the originally planned path for you to discover items on your own pace, thusly creating your own difficulty curve as well.
Oh boy, okay. I've been playing Metroid games for 20 years. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I have. And I've only recently begun 100% complete item runs, probably because of the pandemic, but that's okay. I've only barely mastered how to do Super Metroid's wall jumping. I've pulled off a mock ball once, okay? Speedrunning is a whole other beast that I'm not even close to qualified to cover on this channel, but it does endlessly fascinate me in a way that, it's kind of sexy? I guess? Maybe? I don't know.
Even in teaching you the gameplay, Super Metroid tells a story of a living ecosystem. All of these moments are accompanied by rhythmic background music that skirts on the edge of melodic and ambient sounds of a living, breathing environment that can both inspire and make your skin crawl. We'll soon discuss music design in this series more in a bit, but Kenji Yamamoto took the reins of this game's sound design from the foundation laid by the series' original music composer, Hirokazu Tanaka.
I had a concept that the music for Metroid should be created not as game music, but as music the players feel as if they were encountering a living creature. I wanted to create the sound without any distinction between music and sound effects. The image I had was, anything that comes out from the game is the sound that game makes.
But this begs the question, how do you follow up one of the greatest games ever made? You don't. Once before on this channel, I've covered what it's like for the developers at Nintendo to follow up one of the most iconic games ever made with a direct sequel. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was only a single example of that dedication of a team's desire to innovate and not rest on their laurels, by making something eerily familiar and a dark, corrupted foil to something that is overwhelmingly iconic. It is a curse that both Metroid Fusion and Majora's Mask share in this era of revolutionary Nintendo games at the dawn of the new millennium. In the fourth main part of the Metroid series, we see Samus return to the planet where she once eliminated all but one of the galaxy's remaining Metroids, SR-388. The investigation results in her being infected by a nebulous goo. Dubbed. The investigation results in her being infected by a nebulous goo. Innocent in its appearance, this parasite behaves with a strange and vicious instinct. Before even the title screen appears, Samus is struck with paralysis and her iconic ship crashes into a nearby asteroid belt. One of Nintendo's most powerful characters has narrowly escaped death, and neither she nor the series will ever be the same again. Players of Metroid 2 and Super Metroid will recall the baby Metroid and its sacrifice in the battle against Mother Brain. Here, it lives on through a vaccine that saves Samus's life a second time.
The X in my central nervous system were too embedded to be removed safely. I was given a minimal chance of survival. Then someone found a cure. They proposed using a Metroid cell to make an anti-X vaccine. It seems that the Federation had managed to preserve a cell culture from the last infant Metroid from SR-388. The serum was prepared and injected without delay. The X-parasites were immediately and completely destroyed. As for me, one life ended, yet I survived, reborn as something different. Pondering this fact, I realized I owe the Metroid hatchling my life twice over.
It permanently alters her DNA to share the livelihood of the titular predators that she spent so much of her career destroying. She dreads the future.
During my surgery, the research team sent the last batch of creatures we captured there, as well as the infected pieces of my power suit. After regaining consciousness, I learned that an unexplained explosion rocked the station. For some reason, this awoke a nameless fear in my heart. And now I am being sent there to investigate.
She muses this thought before landing on the biologic space labs, which contains the remnants of the X-parasite and her extracted power suit. She's sent to investigate a distress signal. And that is all before the player takes control. It is a game that puts players alongside Samus through a desolate space station overrun by the parasites as they infect, destroy, and clone themselves into all the other memorable creatures from across the galaxy, freely breeding themselves in isolated environments that attempt to recreate ecosystems that we've seen before. It is a twisted corruption of everything in Metroid's past, even on a gameplay level, as Samus is strung along and more vulnerable than ever due to the Metroid DNA she's been fused with. She's taken along a haunted house ride through the biologic space labs. Her only company is a cold, callous computer giving her orders, which she reluctantly accepts, and a doppelganger stalking her in the shadows. Nearly 20 years following its release, and with its chronological sequel finally nearing completion, we can see Fusion for its deliberate design choices and how the final game is fundamentally influenced by its director, Yoshio Sakamoto. The atmosphere of Super Metroid is well remembered by many, laying the foundation for the Metroidvania genre. Despite the overwhelming praise of this Super Nintendo classic, the franchise would go silent for 8 years. In that time, we would see Konami redefine the Castlevania franchise in 1997 on Sony's PlayStation with Symphony of the Night. It had the gameplay structure of Metroid, inspiring more games with expansive maps, immersive environments, and increasingly powerful dynamic upgrades for rewarding combat and puzzling traversal. This was the beginning of an even bigger movement in video games. While Koji Igarashi would revolutionize visual novel games like Tokimeki Memorial before moving down the halls of Konami to become Castlevania's key visionary director for 2 decades, Yoshio Sakamoto had already done all of this over at Nintendo a decade earlier. Producer and director of the former Research and Development 1, or R&D 1, at Nintendo's Kyoto office, Yoshio Sakamoto had a tricky hill to climb from the moment that he became the face of Nintendo's most famous sci-fi influenced franchise. Sakamoto went to art school at Osaka University of the Arts and was hired by Nintendo early in their history of developing video games, brought to work under Gunpei Yokoi at the in-house studio R&D1 before even the release of the Famicom. He contributed to games like Wrecking Crew, Donkey Kong Jr., Balloon Fight, and Gumshoe. Yokoi, the innovator of hardware like the Game & Watch, the Game Boy, and the Love Tester, would have many disciples within the company, Shigeru Miyamoto included. But when asked about his relationship with Yokoi, Yoshio Sakamoto has often reflected on his desire to put artistic values first.
I had an interaction with Gunpei Yokoi where he said if you can make pixel art, you can make a game. He was the one that was always really pushing us to come up with new and creative ideas. The way he would constrain us was to say, all you have to do is come up with a great idea and give it to a designer. In fact, I don't want you guys to learn any of the technical stuff. It's just going to hold you back.
Sakamoto would often go out of his way to design games fundamentally opposite to Miyamoto's, who preferred to focus on the technical side of game design thanks to his engineering degree. This ethos would manifest in moves like the screw attack, a power-up for Samus that was literally reactive to how Mario's jumping action worked in Super Mario Bros. The Nintendo game inspired by the revolutionary film Alien by 20th Century Fox would not be the end of film influences for Yoshio Sakamoto, as his first lead scenario and writing role at Nintendo would be for two games in the Famicom Detective Club series in 1988 and 89, which revolutionized the visual novel genre for console games. On several occasions, he's even cited the influence of film director Dario Argento. He would use these titles to begin translating cinematic language to game design.
One of the things I really like so much about Argento's films is his use of music and quick cuts to create this amazing contrast from one scene to the next. The music would come along, swelling, and then a big cut with wonderful surprise for the audience. And he was very good at using those sound effects to change the mood immediately on a dime. All of this was very stimulating as I was creating these formulative creative ideas. I thought that this music was perfect for a scary environment, and that it must be possible to include that sort of feeling in game through music. I think some of that came out when I was working on Famicom Detective Club.
When he took over the Metroid property as director, the team produced Super Metroid, utilizing the Super Nintendo's expanded RAM, sound effects, Super FX chip, and a toxic amount of man-hours to create the largest Nintendo game to date. There was a perfect storm of these fundamentals that resulted in one of the greatest games of all time. And yet, after something so rich with world building and replayability, the franchise entered its first hibernation until 2002. This was a time in which Samus' only appearance on the Nintendo 64 was Super Smash Bros. To follow up a game like Super Metroid is daunting, and the fact that Sakamoto was to have a hand in not one but two successors, each slated to share a release date, was not easy. Sakamoto would assist as a producer of Metroid Prime alongside Miyamoto for Retro Studios in Austin, Texas. However, this was only in the capacity to make sure that the contents of the game's story were consistent with what he wanted for the tonality and the plot lines of the series. Even though developing a first-person Metroid with an American studio was a huge gamble, it would end up being the more successful game of the two, and shared a more structural and atmospheric closeness to Super Metroid than Metroid Fusion did. Nintendo's R&D1, on the other hand, would go out of its way to make Metroid 4 an entirely different experience. Using the engine from Wario Land 4, the game was designed from the ground up to build upon the storytelling techniques explored in Super to even greater success. True to the philosophy of his mentor, Sakamoto followed Yokoi's tried-and-true method of developing with lateral thinking of withered technology. Metroid Fusion was released on November 19, 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, the same day as Retro Studios' Metroid Prime for the Nintendo GameCube. But both titles were also the first in the series since Super Metroid.
We're gonna talk about Fusion from here on out, I promise. I know it's a lot of setup. I promise the rest of the video will be about Metroid Fusion, because there's a lot to talk about. There is a lot. There is so much.
The scene has been set for Metroid Fusion by the time Samus docks onto the Space Labs. Once the gameplay begins, its structure allows players to acclimate to just about everything that they'll need to do.
The computer makes for poor company, as it coolly instructs her on every move that she makes. For players of past games, this already feels foreign, maybe even as unsettling as it is for Samus, who's famous for working alone. The game's environments are as sterile as the voice giving orders. Steel hallways, the quiet drifting horizon of space through glass windows, all in stark contrast to the living, breathing planets below. Samus enters a quarantine storage room and finds a Hornode, a creature found all over SR-388. When she kills it, it dissolves into the game's real antagonist. An ex-parasite reappears. Flying around in its pure gelatinous gold-colored form, it shares the resemblance to a large amoeba. Its movements express sentience and purpose. Samus, with her body permanently infused with Metroid DNA, is now a natural apex predator to the X. Now players can absorb them and restore health. Besides eventually saving the animals from Super Metroid, the only organic interaction that Samus has on this station will be the parasitic relationship with the X. This storage room has a container blown to pieces, foreshadowing something ominous. Through dialogue, the computer reveals to Samus that the Federation foolishly stored both the X and her surgically extracted Super Metroid armor. Now, her upgrades from that game have been taken by the X-parasites, which have cloned themselves into the bounty hunter, dubbed the SAX. Because Samus is naturally weaker than ever, this SAX is overwhelmingly powerful. For the first time in a Metroid game, players are encouraged not to fight, but run and hide, setting the tone for the player and Samus's relationship with the monstrous clone for the rest of the game. The reveal comes following the game's first boss battle. Samus descends an elevator on her way to Sector 1 of the station's environmental habitats. But the screen lingers as Samus exits the frame. We seamlessly enter a cutscene. Suddenly an explosion tears the thin metal walls of the room to shreds. We see a brief close-up of the SAX's stolen helmet, its face a vitreous mockery of hers with lifeless eyes. We hear its footsteps marching across the floor as it fires another missile and exits the frame. Those footsteps become a signal to players. When you hear them, you know you need to hide, or the SAX will lead you on a lethal chase. This vertical slice of an opening sequence tells players everything that they should be expecting from Metroid Fusion, while also deconstructing just about everything Super Metroid is known for. Super Metroid never told players exactly where to go or locked them down a certain path with story and dialogue. It didn't have sterile, lonesome hallways in space. It didn't have Samus acquire power-ups by downloading from government-issued internet. And it certainly didn't have creatures overwhelmingly more powerful than Samus that players have no chance of winning against it, even if they tried. Sequence breaking be damned. The result is an evolution of Super Metroid's Prologue. It is an embellishment of that sequence's non-verbal storytelling foundations, but amplified through creativity instead of technology. From a gameplay criticism, it's hand-holding the player through a tutorial. From a storytelling perspective, it's guiding the player along a ride of thrills, scares, and unease. In less than 30 minutes, Sakamoto and R&D1 lay out the formula for the whole of Metroid Fusion, and it only gets better from there. Because Super Metroid was an open-ended game with branching paths of discovery, it was hard for the development team to take players along a specific journey. However, in Fusion, Sakamoto and R&D1 could take the segmented space station and guide players along a path as though they were guests in a haunted house. The resulting experience is objectively linear progression from the outside. But from within, the player is being chased into narrow decisions, scraping by for their lives against the X as each party finds new ways to evolve and dominate the terrain. The player feels the presence of the SAX even indirectly by the motivations of each mission, being told through dialogue which routes it has been taking. This occurs as well through visual evidence of destroyed data rooms and doors that Samus has traveled through already. The game is going out of its way to stall player progress and force them to circle around off the beaten path, trapping them into several routes that only have one destination. When players encounter a room that is being monitored by the SAX, its familiar footsteps can be heard, always starting off screen. The lights are off. A heartbeat pounds in the diegetic background music as players experience the tension of trying to plot an escape without being seen. The man who would usually compose music for the franchise, Kenji Yamamoto, would spend this time on the synthesizer-heavy score for Metroid Prime, leaving Minako Hamano to develop Fusion's score mostly on her own. Hamano is most known for some of Super Metroid's most memorable tracks, including Crade, Gridley, the end credits anthem, and the Crateria theme. As well as the iconic melodies found in The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. These little details and the pieces of diegetic background music tell a richer story than Metroid has ever had before. And a lot of it comes down to the behavior of these enemies. Hamano had this to say regarding the background music of the game and how she acted upon Sakamoto's direction.
I aimed for serious ambient music rather than melody. I had to change the music in accordance with Adam's dialogue in the navigation room. The navigation room changes with each new scene, and the background music flows from tense to suspicious. I think I made the background music when you were being chased by the SAX the most hysteric.
Evolving to a sound card that integrates software-based processing, Fusion's soundtrack presented something that feels incomplete and alien, giving the traditional adventurous melodies a sense of unease and anxiety. The score drones between these artificial environments, increasingly more frightening and inhuman, but never without its own form of dissatisfying melodic resolution, almost as if the sheet music is disintegrating in real time. It faintly emulates the ethereal, living environmental noises of Super Metroid, but without the satisfaction of conclusive melody. The only feelings of triumph come from the score near the game's ending, as Samus prepares for her final encounter and escape. The SAX even has a behavior that fulfills storytelling through visual action. A resounding piece of fan service is one of the smallest details where the doppelganger attacks Samus. As it chases her, it attacks with a recognizable strategy to fans, the Ice Beam immediately followed by super missiles. This has been the surefire way for players to destroy Metroids throughout the franchise until now. And now that Samus's DNA is one with those Metroids, she has the same vulnerabilities to cold temperature, which the X seek to exploit as they gather more knowledge and power throughout the game. Even the smaller X demonstrate this kind of intelligence through action. When players descend into the nocturnal habitat in Sector 6, the computer warns Samus that the X have gathered here to propagate a Sub-Zero variant of themselves. The tension escalates as Samus explores the dark region with the new variant chasing her throughout. If Samus absorbs them, they'll begin to freeze her from within. This is until she finally encounters an X-Core, which when defeated restores her temperature resistance with the iconic Varia suit. The freezing blue X doesn't realize her upgrade at first, but just enough time passes for players to notice that it learns the strategy has failed, and then begin to flee once more. While these changes and encounters are merely a sort of puppet theater, for a portable 2D adventure at the time it was revolutionary, and in retrospect breathes life into the world building by only sometimes stalling the gameplay with exposition in the navigation room. If there are details spawned from exposition, they're backed up by moments like these as the player begins to understand the X's means of survival. Such as is the case for the game itself, Samus is not quite so recognizable in Fusion either. After her vaccine, she's covered with an organic mesh webbed over her body armor. This is a visual design choice that carries through the gameplay. While her core movement is similar to Super Metroid, she naturally moves faster and can grasp onto ledges. These abilities are not gifts from the Chozo, but a rigid countermeasure that she has provided. Explosive upgrades like bombs and the new ice-spreading diffusion missiles are installed through Federation data rooms. She also can absorb her abilities back from the parasites which stole them from her. The SAX didn't keep everything for itself though, and the other X adapt by cloning themselves into powerful, threatening creatures. Each of these boss fights presents a familiar power-up used in the context of a mutant doppelganger of organic and inorganic creatures that the X has destroyed and studied in their attempt to overwhelm Samus and use her own abilities against her. Defeating the Arachnus X restores the Morph Ball, Zazabi X, the High Jump, Ceres, the Speed Booster, Ghetto, the Space Jump, the Plant Core, the Plasma Beam, and a Nightmare, restoring the Gravity Suit. Even leading up to these boss battles, they visually manipulate the environment, creating a humid fog for breeding in Sector 1, creeping vines in the tropical Sector 2, decimating the Arctic Sector 5 like a refrigerator torn to shreds, disabling the power in the main reactor core, and a blisteringly tense timer sequence rushing to the pyrotechnic Sector 3, where the X attempt to cause a meltdown by cloning themselves into a human scientist that looks like George Costanza.
George is getting upset!
These sectors may appear linear at first glance, but as the player makes a return journey to each, it is at a disadvantage while the X try to undermine Samus's progress and shut the station down to continue their procreation, increasingly in menacing ways. For the first time in a Metroid game, Samus is at her wit's end to keep control of her mission against a persistent antagonist. Just as Samus finishes visiting every sector for the first time, the game ratchets up the stakes. Well, shit. As the player makes an ascent to the main deck at the game's midpoint, the power shuts down. The X have shut down the main reactor. Samus needs to trek from her ship down through the steep rafters to the station's reactor core, where it is choked by vines. The boss encountered here is Ghetto, a massive animatronic spider that behaves like a hyperactive android.
And this boss fight was the ire of me in 2004. Losing this fight against this stupid spider and having to backtrack to it from the main deck for several minutes over and over was demoralizing, and it caused me to put down the game for several weeks in frustration. The fight wasn't overwhelming once the rhythm was recognized. It was tough, but fair. You know, get good, as the old gamers say, right? I'm gonna cry.
The spider traps you in a narrow corridor, and you not only need to dodge its deadly grasp where it drops you from the ceiling, but it also spat fire to keep you from hiding in the corner. It is a boss that forces you to begin reacting to it in an instant, instead of waiting for it to show weaknesses. Succeeding over the game's first truly challenging boss is sweet relief, but Samus isn't out of the woods just yet. The exit for this room dumps her back into the tropical Sector 2, but still unable to save the game, the player encounters the SAX. Samus can't hide this time, needing to fall right on top of it and run. If you manage to make an escape, the X have grown more powerful from here, and Samus's weapons take more effort to take them down. When she encounters the Plant Core X soon afterwards, it's visually clear that this creature is responsible for the aforementioned vegetation overgrowth. The battle is a super claustrophobic one that emulates both of Super Metroid's Spore Spawn and Kraid. As the player regains the last of Samus's upgrades, they can access shortcuts that allow each of the 6 sectors to seamlessly loop between one another for upgrade cleanup that they may have missed. This, in addition to reopening locked hatches after a completed save, make accomplishing a 100% run of a Metroid game the most accessible that it has ever been, as Super Metroid notoriously locked players from backtracking once deep enough into Mother Brain's lair. Shine Spark challenges here are segmented into isolated corners that present themselves more as optional obstacle courses for players who really want to do everything the game has to offer. By the time players reach this point, the end is in sight. But first, they're met with a story twist.
No entry without authorization. Warning, no entry.
Samus once again returns to Nocturnal Sector 6 for a final encounter with the security bot X. Oh yeah, there's a security robot where you have to hang off of the ceiling ladder and it fires missiles at you and you fire missiles at it and the water's electrocuted. It's very exhilarating. Even following this encounter, a security measure was tripped upon entry, with a chirping threat that grows louder the further that Samus descends.
Warning, no entry without authorization.
From here, the environment shows evidence of the worst-case scenario. The Federation has been breeding Metroids. This reveal is foreshadowed in environment design, with massive Metroid husks scattered throughout the map. The SAX stands in the middle of a lab, loudly firing into a room full of Metroids. Samus swiftly sets the restricted zone to jettison from the station into space. Kinda like that other famous sci-fi franchise, you know. In the next room, Metroid Fusion makes an unprecedented decision as the computer chastises Samus for her decision to eject the restricted zone. It then claims such an action to be a feeble effort. Not only are there 10 more SAX duplicates still aboard the station, but it also explains away the Federation's breeding of Metroids for peaceful measures. The computer's attitude has worn thin on Samus up to this point. The final straw is the news that the human heads of the Galactic Federation will be docking onto the station to control the situation. Because that always works out in science fiction, doesn't it? After these kinds of comments throughout the entire game suggest she has no authority on this mission, Samus, finally, after nearly 4 complete adventures of doing their bidding, says no. She snapped at the computer, engaging in her first ever two-way conversation, exploding in a passionate outrage against the Federation's choices. She sees they were using her heroics for their own gain, as she learns of their desire to capture and weaponize the SAX just as they did the Metroids. She decides to set the station to self-destruct. In a desperate plea, she asks the computer for help, calling it by the name that she had internalized for it throughout her inner monologues, Adam, the name of her deceased commanding officer. The computer takes pause. When she finally thinks she's alone in the galaxy doomed, the computer corrects her suggestion with something that Adam would do. If the course of the station is altered to impact the planet before detonation, it would thoroughly eradicate all of the X both on the station and on SR-388. From there, Samus finally sets off to face the SAX before setting the detonation sequence. In a final push, the SAX storms in with its chaotic chase music, but Samus and the player are ready for it. This fight articulates how evenly matched Samus and her doppelganger actually are. Once it devolves into a mutant toad thing, it then devolves into an X-core like all of the others. The SAX is vanquished, but its core escapes into the ventilation shaft before Samus can absorb it. Once the impact course is set, Samus has a mere 3 minutes to escape back to her ship, but not before one final boss encounter against an Omega Metroid. The creature can practically kill Samus in one hit, but in an instinctual moment of survival, the SAX returns to combat it and is swiftly destroyed by the Omega Metroid. Decimated into an X-core, it can now be absorbed by Samus to return her lost powers, including the Ice Beam. This sequence is the most faithful throwback to Super Metroid in just about the entire game, as it mirrors the final encounter with Mother Brain and the sacrifice of the baby Metroid. However, Fusion doesn't make this fight as much of a cakewalk. If not timed correctly, a player can run out the clock or be killed to still get a game over. Only after this do we re-encounter the rescued animals, the Dakora and Edekun, the monkey and emu-like creatures that taught players how to use their extra abilities in Super Metroid. In return, they bring the ship back for Samus before the station enters the atmosphere of SR-388 on its collision course.
In the context of the series' overall story and a story arc for Samus herself, this moment is a really nice, wonderful piece of resolution because despite some clunky dialogue about the computer being a clone of Adam's brain before he died, that kind of kills the vibe. But more importantly, these animals that you literally go out of your way to save in the past game, and then you save again as a part of the story in this game, they're returning the favor to rescue Samus at this moment, and it's emblematic of her growth. It's germinated from the moment that she took pity on that baby larva Metroid. And so it's now that she has a growth where she understands the need to have reverence for the natural order of things in the galaxy. And it ties into, you know, her growing to the point where she can say no to the Federation asking her to commit genocide. So I think that that's great. Let your main characters grow, you know?
Up to this point, Samus Aran spends the biggest moments of her career tearing down creatures in the name of people she can't trust. This was germinated in Metroid 2 when she saved the baby larva, and it has now signified a change in her character. The Chozo who raised her bred the Metroids to counter the X, and the Federation have done the same here. Samus reaches a breaking point that marks the end of her relationship with the organization, choosing to be a fugitive. She concludes this journey in Metroid Fusion by recognizing the symbiotic need of life in the galaxy. Unlike the baby Metroid she once rescued, she refuses this powerful information of life to be in the wrong hands. This plants the seeds for Metroid Dread, where Samus is a fugitive of the Federation after destroying the biologic space labs and the SAX. At least, so we're told. Now it appears she's at an even further disadvantage than in Fusion when she arrives on the new planet, ZDR. The SAX sequences are embellished on here as the Emi robots stalk her throughout the map to hunt her down. Their origins unknown at the time of writing, but they can and will kill her on sight with little effort. The Emi's likeness to the SAX and the Atom computer are something that they've been outwardly promoting as a part of Metroid Dread, as in their Dread Report Volume 4 on the day of the series' 35th anniversary states. The SAX is a tremendous threat that Samus comes across many times over the course of the Metroid Fusion game. Each encounter, where Samus runs or hides from the SAX, was an in-game event that springs on the player. However, we thought, what would happen if we evolved this? This line of thinking greatly affected the concept of the Emi sections in the Metroid Dread game. Also, as the Metroid Fusion game is a direct prequel to the Metroid Dread game, you will find many threads weaving the two stories together. For example, the reason why Samus' suit looks the way that it does and the appearance of the Atom computer AI in Metroid Dread are directly connected to the events of Metroid Fusion. It will be curious to see what in the DNA of Metroid's gameplay Nintendo will backtrack on as well, indicating in this quote that Dread may return to more openness to sequence breaking in its level design. The Super Metroid game can be said to offer the greatest flexibility for exploration in the series. You can enjoy similar flexibility in the Metroid Dread game depending on how you take advantage of your abilities. You might be able to find ways to obtain weapons, items, and abilities earlier than the intended timing. We encourage you to try and discover alternate routes of exploration. One thing is for certain, Samus Aran will never be the same moving forward in Metroid's story. Even visually evident in the organic-looking muscle striations on the exterior of her new power suit, showing the physical scars of the events of Fusion. In developing Metroid Fusion, Yoshio Sakamoto never took the easy way out. While other properties were simply getting ports of Super Nintendo classics to the Game Boy Advance in its first couple of years, R&D1 went out of its way to not only make a new adventure, but to make it unsettlingly different from such a classic game as Super Metroid. It prioritized telling a story, emulating horror movies and sci-fi films. It got us in the head of Samus for the first time. It gave us a linear structure that embellished unique storytelling beats and a satisfying challenge in the game's back half, and overall feels cohesive in the execution of tone in every detail it has. To this day, Sakamoto articulates in interviews that he's always wanting fan feedback to make these games different.
We always try to do something really unprecedented, something people have never played before. Many of our designers and creators want to challenge something new, rather than simply porting over an old title. That's something I hope we'll always do. If you can challenge something new, you can look forward to the public response, be it good or bad. Depending on the response from the public, we can explore some new paths for the new game, which is the only way for us to move ahead. I know that Metroid always has to grow. We've always been challenging with the Metroid games.
As we know now, for the game that will not be named, it doesn't always work out that way. Yoshio Sakamoto has had the musings of Metroid Dread's mechanics brewing in the back of his mind as far back as 2003, following Fusion's release, where he wanted to take the SAX and embellish on it, right? From a mechanical standpoint. We'll never get another game like Metroid Fusion, not because of its criticisms, but because right now Metroid is at a pivotal evolutionary state where it needs to survive or die.
Where R&D1 didn't simply make a Super Metroid 2, that game lives on in the decades since Metroid Other M's release with indie games, Hollow Knight, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Dead Cells, The Messenger, Axiom Verge, and Iconoclasts. All of these games took the weaving structure of Metroid and Castlevania and innovated upon them. Now, we have legions of young adults who have played every single moment of a Metroid game in the form of something else. This, in retrospect, makes Metroid Fusion a genius decision for its time. A tonally confident, creepy game that still succeeds in the escalating power and hunt for secrets that you would expect, and paced in a way that is intended for pick-up-and-play mentality on a portable gaming device. As we reach its 20th anniversary next year, it is no longer the burden of Metroid Fusion to just be a sequel to Super Metroid. Now it stands apart as a truly unique Metroid 4.